it is completely about fact and about the facts as we know them, and not what's currently trending. Because as we've probably all noticed with food, you get a story one week and a different story another week, and they contradict each other very often. And there's a tendency as well for us to focus in on the ones that we most enjoy hearing about. As this quote suggests, people love to hear good news about their bad habits. And if I say chocolate, then that probably resonates with some people. So that was certainly the news I liked to hear about my bad habit when I had it. So it can happen as well with fat. And it's certainly a trend at the moment to let's say, to eat more fat than perhaps we used to. It used to be demonized, and now it's gone the other way. And so we're trying to look at where it really sits. And that's really what this is all about. And we've got a list of issues that we want to address first. So we'll give you an idea of what they are.
So, which foods contain fat?
How much dietary fat is good for us? Is there a maximum amount?
Is there a minimum amount?
Do our health circumstances influence our fat requirements?
Is fat just fat, or does the type of fat matter?
And why is the messaging about dietary fat intake so inconsistent?
Almost all whole foods contain some fat in varying quantities. As you can see from the photographs, some are more obvious than others. You wouldn't be surprised to see that there is fat in meat products, animal products. Plants also have cells, and cells need fats, and therefore you see there the lettuce, for example. It's not the most obvious perhaps when you think of fat, but it does contain fat, and anything in between like nuts, seeds, grains, etc. Processed foods also have added fats, and that's why they get often criticized, and probably for good reason. And the food industry really understands what we call the mouthfeel of fats, and therefore they really research when they're producing these products. What is it? How can we make it really, really appealing to the consumer? And they do that through the fact that they know that adding fat is the taste and the mouthfeel of fat is very, very addictive for some people.
Along with sugar and salt, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so how much fat is the right amount? And we can't actually give you an answer, unfortunately, because there doesn't seem to be a specific answer per person. There's a Professor Roy Taylor from Newcastle University, whose hypothesis is that we have a personal fat threshold. And that could well be the case, that each of us requires a different amount. And it may even be that we require different amounts at different stages in our lives, and also in situations where we're perhaps unwell. And that's what we're going to next here, just to highlight some of the things that people have done with a quite specific amount of fat. And there was a lifestyle heart trial about 20 years ago now, conducted by Dr. Dean Ornish. It was a renowned study and really made the headlines, because by looking at both, five things in all, diet, cessation of smoking, exercise, relaxation, and a social component where people were able to come together and share their problems and so on, share their life issues. He managed to reverse heart disease, which had never been heard of before and seemed impossible. So this was really exciting. What he needed to do in the dietary context there was to have the right amount of the macronutrients, so the carbohydrates, the fat, and the protein. And each time he tried to get the right amount, as he was working towards doing this study, he found the fat didn't work. It was too much. And he had to bring it right down eventually to 10% of the overall calories of their diet. So that meant, that's what these figures are at the side there. The carbohydrate content of the diet was 80%. We're not talking refined carbohydrates here, like white bread and pasta and pasties and so on. This is fruits and vegetables, for example, and whole grains. The protein was 10%, and so was the fat. So this is really low fat that I think he was surprised himself he had to go that low, but it did work. And then there was another one.
Yeah, just to put it into context as well. So 10% of fat, probably on an average diet, if you're looking at, say, 2,000 calories, 10% of fat is 200 calories. So that's quite a small amount. Fat is 9 calories per gram, so 200 calories. You're talking about 20, 21, 22 grams of fat in the whole day. So that is quite low. Now, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn also headed up another classic study, which was kicked off around 2011, ran through till about 2014. And he showed that it was possible to reverse coronary artery disease by putting people on a very low fat diet. And initially, the diet had nothing that had a face or a mother, so no animal products whatsoever. It was based on, also it had no nuts or seeds. It was legumes, grains, fruit, and vegetables. It was revised slightly later on to include flax seeds. And what was found was the people who adhered to the trial, which I think was a total of 3 years altogether, those people actually managed to significantly reverse heart disease such that they came off the medication. Those that didn't adhere to the diet actually didn't have any change in their diet. In most cases, actually, they deteriorated, their condition deteriorated. So again, another example where reducing fat consumption can be very, very pivotal in reducing coronary artery disease.
And then moving away from heart disease to diabetes, the PCRM, which is the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, conducted their own trial into whether or not diabetes could be reversed by also choosing the same sort of diet that Dean Ornish had employed. In fact, it's Caldwell Esselstyn to some extent, but it was much more similar to the Dean Ornish one because it was, again, an 80-10-10 diet. So 80% of the calories were carbohydrate, 10% protein, and 10% fat. And it was successful. It was a lot more successful than the control group, which you would probably expect. Only the control group was made up of people who were following the instructions of the American dietary guidelines for managing diabetes. And the diabetes reversal on this study came out very well. And it's reversal, not management. And we'll come to that a little bit more later as well. So in a therapeutic context, sometimes it seems that a very low fat intake, probably for a relatively short time, depending on the issue and how profound it is, may well be a good idea. However, there was a fibromyalgia study from 2001, and it was very successful in all of its outcomes. People had a lot better quality of life as a result of this study. And this was a dietary one as well, and it was also considered to be a low-fat diet. The food was largely, it was a raw food diet effectively, but very common foods, nothing unusual, very, very straightforward foods. Now, in this low-fat diet, the fat was actually 24%, which of course is a fair bit more than the 10% that we've just been looking at. So was this optimal? Maybe. It certainly worked for them. We can't know. We can't know if it might have been slightly better for them to be a little bit lower, because low seemed to work for diabetes and heart disease. We've no idea, but we've also no idea whether or not, just to what extent the diet itself interacted all together to create the positive effects, because of course these people were not cooking foods, so they were getting the full nutrient content of the foods, and certainly the antioxidants that are abundant in raw foods. So there must have been other factors there as well which supported their recovery.
So for the sake of balance, it's also, we need to look at the flip side. What about a ketogenic diet or a keto diet, which you may have heard about? And a keto diet is a diet which it's really designed to make the body start to burn fat. And it does that by really restricting the amount of carbohydrates in the diet. They're seen as the bad guys, and particularly the refined carbohydrates. So grains, for example. So cutting out anything that's got flour in it, so bread, pasta, pastry, biscuits, cakes, that kind of thing, and fruit to a degree as well. Now, this diet has been shown in the short term to be very effective for weight loss and also for diabetes management. So keeping blood sugar levels level and not having spikes, because you're not feeding the blood with extra sugar through the refined carbohydrates. But in the longer term, there are doubts as to, or concerns as to, whether it's actually a safe diet to eat, because it includes a high fat, high protein content. And over time, there are risks associated with a high fat diet. It's not really been shown to actually reverse diabetes in the longer term, because it doesn't get rid of the underlying problem. If you start to introduce carbohydrates again, the body will probably still have the same problem in terms of dealing with it. There's also been a study on COVID-19 severity, and it's been shown that those on a more keto type diet had greater odds of a moderate to severe COVID-19 symptoms compared to those on a plant-based diet. And therefore, it's really important to look at the whole context of these diets. What does it actually mean for our longer term health? If we also look at some population studies, like the blue zones, for example, which we did cover on a previous presentation, and these are areas of the world where there's a high percentage of people living to a healthy old age, a high percentage of centenarians. And what people have in common is relatively low dietary fat consumption. And that was shown to be a factor in healthy longevity. So again, it's worth looking at the overall view.
So let's have a look at some of the different types of fat. That this will be no surprise to most people. We will start off with saturated fat, and we'll also have a look at how it gets broken down. It's the one that's solid at room temperature. It's very stable. It's found in all animal foods. So the cheese there, we've got meat and we've got butter. But there are also some plant foods, one or two that are fairly high in saturated fat. Coconut oil is one, palm oil is another, and cacao or cocoa butter is the other well-known one. These fats, saturated fats, are not labeled as essential. If you've heard of essential fats, saturated fat isn't one of them, simply because we can make our own. We can synthesize that in our own bodies, so we don't have to get it from the diet.
How does the body break down fat? Well, the breakdown of fats really requires extra resources for the body. We need to emulsify fat, which means to break it down into smaller amounts. And to do that, we need to have bile. So the liver and the gallbladder produces bile, which helps to break down the fat. But at the same time, bile contains cholesterol. About 60% of bile is made up by cholesterol. So what happens is when we eat fat, and particularly saturated fat, because that needs the most bile to break it down, because saturated fat is the most difficult to break down, we produce more bile. Therefore, we produce more cholesterol, which is one of the reasons why saturated fat and fat in general in the diet can increase our levels of cholesterol. Also, some foods have dietary cholesterol in them, and we're talking there animal foods. No plants have cholesterol in them. It's just animal foods. So when we produce this cholesterol, the body needs to remove it or use it. If there's excess cholesterol, the body can then, one of the ways that we remove it from the body is through fiber. Again, fiber only exists in plants, not in animal foods, which is why plants really do constitute an essential part of our diet. There is something that's worth mentioning though, coconut oil. Now, coconut oil has gone through quite a number of different, let's say there's a lot of differing views about coconut oil, and it's been touted as a superfood, particularly over the last few years. And I think that's died down a little bit now, as it's become more known that coconut oil actually, because it is a saturated fat, or at least it contains a good deal of the fat within coconut oil is saturated fat, not all of it, it actually is not as healthy for us as we might have thought. It has been used therapeutically to increase people's cholesterol levels. So that again indicates why the saturated fat element is productive of cholesterol. But as with plants, our cell membranes do need fat. So we don't want to demonize fat per se. It's really important for us. It helps to insulate our body, and it helps us to make hormones. As I say, cell membranes need it in the plants as well, because it gives the plant cells rigidity, where it's saturated fat. But the saturated fat doesn't need to come from the diet, because we can produce our own.
Let's take a look at another type of fat. So move away from the saturated fat to the monounsaturated fat, often also known as omega-9, although it's not so commonly talked about in that way. This is the one that's found in various nuts and also in olive oil. It's less stable than saturated fat, which means it is liquid at room temperature. Unless you put it in the fridge, it's going to stay quite liquid. And it means it's reasonably stable, but it's less stable than saturated fat. And I keep mentioning stability, or we both will, in fact, partly because industry favors the more stable fats when they're producing foods, simply because they have a longer shelf life. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. The choice of fats may not be what's best for your health. It might be what's best for the shelf and for the saleability of it. So there's avocado as well. That's got a fairly high amount of this monounsaturated fat too. Olive oil is one we just want to have a little bit of a look at, because it's one of those that, as we started this presentation, it's one of those that seems to swing from one thing to the other about whether or not it's healthy. And a lot of the research suggests that it is. And there are two things to consider when you're looking at the health properties of olive oil. Clearly, it does have some components that make it healthier than certain other oils. I think that's beyond doubt. It's also interesting to notice that the studies tend to be either on the populations where it's eaten, so Mediterranean populations where they eat a traditional Mediterranean diet, or on dietary changes in people, say in Britain, for example, where they're changing and adding olive oil into their diet. In each of these cases, there are some considerations. In the Mediterranean situation, they're eating a whole Mediterranean diet. They are not afraid of fruits and vegetables, these people. And if they're eating a traditional diet, those components of the diet will make a difference to them. So isolating the olive oil as something specific is quite hard to do. It's part of the whole. In the case of people trialing olive oil as a means of a study to produce results because they're having a change of diet, well, it's always worth considering what it is that they're changing from, because it is really quite easy to make olive oil an improvement on something that was previously being eaten. It may be that people were eating more processed fats before, or that they were having large amounts of saturated fat that then just put a burden on the body. So one way or another, there are a lot of things to consider with olive oil. We would suggest that if you are using it, then fine, but maybe go easy with it. And occasionally perhaps consider using the actual olives, because each time you use the entire food, you're getting all of the nutrients that food contains, rather than just the 100% fat, which any oil is. And of course, an oil doesn't have fiber either, so it doesn't have that benefit. But a small amount on salad is probably ideal for most people. If you choose to withdraw from it altogether, which is what we've now done, it is possible, and I have to say now it's easy, it wasn't easy initially, to make dressings using, for example, nuts and seeds to give it some thickness, or none at all for certain of our dressings. It is possible. It took a little bit of getting used to, but we do make quite a lot of dressings now with chia seeds, hemp seeds, flax seeds, and so on, or maybe occasionally cashews. It can be done, and they can be really tasty. So it's possible.
There is one other thing that we haven't mentioned as well about fat in terms of one of its benefits, and that's that it helps us to absorb certain vitamins. So the fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin K, vitamin E, vitamin D. And therefore, we do need some fat in our diet. But do we need to use the liquid fat to do that? And actually, that's possibly one of the reasons in the Mediterranean diet why olive oil has seemed to be, let's say, a successful fat or a popular fat, because they eat generally, the traditional Mediterranean diet incorporates a lot of vegetables and fruits, which are full of vitamins. And it helps to absorb those vitamins when they put olive oil on. So that's worth bearing in mind. But we also get fat within whole food other than olive oil. So if you're having a lot of fat food that contains fat, like avocados, again, it will enable us to absorb those vitamins as well. But then we've got polyunsaturated fats, which some of you or all of you may well have heard of, and they're the ones that we generally associate with being more healthy. And the reason we do that is that they contain omega-6 or incorporate omega-6 and omega-3 fats. Now, these fats are essential for us, meaning that we do need to get them from the diet. We don't make these ourselves. Now, typically in Western societies, we tend to eat too much omega-6 and too little omega-3. Now, why is this? Well, it's because omega-6 tends to come within meats, for example, and also within vegetable oils, and we use it a lot in processed foods because they use a lot of vegetable oils to preserve the processed foods. It comes in nuts and seeds and grains, and we eat a lot of those in the Western diets. Now, that tends to crowd out the amount of omega-3 we eat. And why is that bad? Well, omega-6 is pro-inflammatory and omega-3 is anti-inflammatory. So the more of the pro-inflammatory fat we have, the more likely we are going to experience that inflammation in our bodies. And it's worth bearing this in mind. We'll come and look at this in a little bit more detail because it's quite important.
And looking a little bit more closely at omega-3, we'll try and identify what's going on here and what you could possibly do if you don't want to be eating fish for whatever reason. Because we know that these, I think they're fairly well-known omega-3 fats, the EPA and DHA, these are the ones that everybody talks about you absolutely have to have in your diet, which is true. It's assumed that they can only come from oily fish, and not everybody, for whatever reason, wants to be eating oily fish. So the best people to look at in some ways are vegans, and whether or not the omega-3 that they eat, that we eat, in fact, which is ALA, this is the first omega-3. So omega-3 number one, if you like, in terms of what's well known, is ALA, moves on to EPA and then DHA. Healthy vegans are likely to eat leafy green vegetables and flax seeds and chia seeds. And all of these are very good sources, comparatively, very good sources of this ALA omega-3, really good sources. Clearly, you would need to eat a lot of leafy greens if you wanted to get all of your omega-3 from lettuce and other such leafy greens. But it's easier with the flaxseed and the chia seed, and we'll give you an amount in a moment. These three sources can be converted. However, it wasn't known until recently that that was possible, because we had to wait until a 2010 study from the UK, which showed that you can actually convert from the first one, the ALA, to the EPA and DHA without the need for fish. There's a big caveat though. It wasn't absolutely everybody who could convert. And there are all sorts of possible reasons for that, which we can't go into at this stage. But what's worth knowing is that these people were able to convert because they were different people. If you think about most studies carried out at universities, they get the cohort, the people that in the studies, the participants, from around and about, close to where they live, local residents, and they are part of the general public. Well, this study did things differently. It actually recruited people for whom it was really important to know whether or not they make this conversion. They recruited vegans. Now, those of them who were eating a healthy whole food vegan diet, we can assume, and we don't know because there was a mix of vegans there, we can assume that they had certain advantages. All of them will have been getting no omega-6 from animal foods. That's a given because they're vegan. They will have had limited processed foods because a whole food diet doesn't include much in the way of processed foods. And they will also have very likely been having good plant sources of this ALA. And I've written there no competition. So what's that all about? Well, it's because in order to convert from the ALA to the EPA and DHA, there is one enzyme that does this job, and it can do it perfectly well in a lot of people. However, it's also the same enzyme that does the same conversion process for omega-6. And if you think about what we've been saying about most people having an excess of omega-6, this enzyme's got its job cut out with omega-6. It's not going to waste its time on omega-3 when there's not much of it. So it doesn't. It spends all its time converting omega-6 because that's what's there in abundance. And the omega-3 doesn't get a look in. So that's why it's really important for everybody, whatever we eat, to ensure that we are having enough omega-3 proportional to the omega-6 that we're eating. That's the reason. So if you are going to choose to do this in a more plant-based way, if that's where your interest lies, then a tablespoon of flaxseed in a day will do this, as will a heaped tablespoon of chia seed. Or you could mix them, of course, and have a bit of both. There are other seeds that will do this to a degree, not quite as well. These are the best. Hemp seeds also have omega-3, and walnuts do too. And if you're really willing to eat loads and loads of leafy green vegetables, you can actually get enough from them. We know some people who do, but it's quite rare. And they need to be ground so that you actually have access to the oils.
That's the seeds, not
the seeds,
not
not
the
the lettuce. Don't grind your lettuce, no.
So what is the desirable omega-6 to omega-3 ratio? Well, per day, it's suggested that a ratio of 4:1 in favor of omega-6 is about right. It's actually believed our ancestors had close to a 1:1 ratio, but they really did eat quite differently from us. And we're not suggesting everybody just goes back to eating what they were eating, because they maybe had other nutritional issues based on what was available at the time. Modern humans, though, in Western societies, have around 12:1 in the UK. It's measured, it's estimated, and 20:1 in the USA. So that's a huge increase in favor of omega-6. That's 5 times the amount of the recommended amount. And if you remember what happens, does this matter? Yes, because a higher consumption of omega-6 is pro-inflammatory. Inflammation is involved in the majority of diseases. And it probably therefore comes as no surprise that some of the sickest people in Western societies live in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. And it's possible that this does come from the way that we eat, the inflammation in our bodies from having too much omega-6 foods, as well as too much sugar and processed foods as well. So is this the only consideration? Should we be just concerned about how much omega-6 and omega-3 we eat? Well, no, it's not the only consideration, because an imbalance of fats generally is problematic. So our cells in our body need some saturated fat for rigidity, and they need the omega-6 and 3 fats for a whole load of reasons, including electrical conductivity. So our heart and nervous system, our eyes, for example, require omega-3 fats, our skin requires omega-6, etc. And did I mention our brain? Our brain particularly needs omega-3 fats. So it needs to be in the right balance.
So what is it about the standard Western diet that is so problematic? It's really bringing together what we've said. We have typically too much saturated fat in the diet, and the omega-6 to 3 ratio is usually unfavorable in most people's diets. And these two together are problematic, because it means that the types of fat are unbalanced and in the wrong proportions. We need all of them. We only need 2 from the diet. That's the omega-6 and the omega-3, because we can make the saturated fat ourselves. And it actually starts to impact on the cell membrane because the cell membrane will be made up of these fats. And if there's too much saturated fat, the cell membrane will be too rigid. It needs the rigidity, but it doesn't need too much. And that in itself is a problem. Added to that, if the mix of omega-3 and 6 is wrong, then that's also a problem, and it leads to effects in the cell being either diminished or exaggerated. So let's have a quick look at what I'm talking about here. You have on each of your cells insulin receptors, which are responsible for drawing the blood sugar into the cell, so out of the blood and into the cell where it's supposed to be, to give you energy and all the rest of it that we need, the blood sugar for the sugar that comes into our system from our diet. If the membrane is compromised by the inappropriate level of fats, then the insulin receptor cannot do its job effectively. So it will get some of the sugar in, but not all of it, and it'll struggle to do it, and it'll keep having to push out more insulin to try and get more in. And this is the start of diabetes. And it's very frustrating that most people are of the opinion that the villain is carbohydrates, the sugars and so on. Clearly, if there's already a sugar-related problem, then adding more is indeed a problem. But the starting point was fat in the cells that wasn't right. That's where it begins, and that's what's not addressed. And in not addressing it, it means that you can manage your diabetes if you have it quite effectively by cutting out the carbohydrates, but you have not reversed the problem. You've not actually been able to create a situation whereby later, when you've managed it well enough, you can eat those carbohydrates again. And I'm talking healthy carbohydrates, even fruits and so on. Healthy carbohydrates will still put up your blood sugar because you've not resolved the problem if the fat content is high. And if you've not been eating carbohydrates and fruit and all the rest of it, and we're talking even bread, whole grain bread here is a good food. If you've not been eating much of that, then you've been eating fat because you have to be eating something, and you're probably being contributing to making the cell membranes more rigid and having the wrong amounts of the other fats in as well. Now, the other one here that we've got that's also recorded as having a diminished effect is serotonin, which then can lead on to depression. Or can it? Now, this one we've got a big question mark over, because if you've been listening to the news in the past few weeks, and it is literally in the past few weeks, there's been a big news story, in big news health story anyway, that the absence or lack of enough serotonin in the brain is actually not the cause for depression. So despite having believed this for years, and this is what doctors have always been operating on, it seems, based on a very detailed and long and drawn out study that does look very convincing, it is not the serotonin that's responsible. So we don't know if that one is still the case.
And I think also we need to tread carefully with this, because if anyone's on medication,
oh yes,
for some reason which the scientists don't know and the doctors don't know, even though it's thought not to be serotonin that's the issue, or diminished serotonin that's the issue, the medications, the SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, as they're called, like Prozac, for example, they still do the job at helping people to manage their depression.
For some.
Not every case, and they don't know why this is. It's quite interesting. Anyway, that's going on to another area, a kind of medical area, which we're not really qualified to talk about in detail, but we just thought we'd put that out there.
So the other two listed here have an exaggerated effect. So there are also angiotensin receptors on cells, and if the fats are wrong in the cell membrane, then the effect is exaggerated, leading to fluid retention. So those cells hold on to fluid, and that is also an issue for hypertension, for high blood pressure. And then the other one mentioned here is estrogen. You may well have heard of people who've had estrogen dominant diseases. I had endometriosis about 20 years ago. And what was this a result of the fat in my diet? It could have been, because I was eating quite a lot. It's quite possible. So breast cancer and fibroids are other examples of that. So it does matter. It matters for inflammation, and it matters for other health issues as well, which are quite diverse, as you can see just from this relatively short list here. So have we answered the questions?
Annette, which foods contain fat?
Almost all foods, whether they're whole or processed.
How much dietary fat is good for us? Is there a maximum amount?
Probably not. The actual amount isn't known and may vary from person to person.
I think it's probably rather than probably not, actually.
Well, yeah, probably not. It's both, isn't it? Really? Because we just don't really, they may be, but we don't know what it is, I think, yes.
Is there a minimum amount we need?
In the case of essential fats, which are the omega-3 and 6, then yes, as we've already said.
Do our health circumstances influence our fat requirements?
Possibly. So we gave the example of the health study, the heart study, where it did need to be very low for that trial to work.
Is fat just fat, or does the type of fat matter?
The type matters.
Why is the messaging about dietary fat intake so inconsistent?
Because of prevailing dietary trends at the moment, fat is in vogue again, and didn't used to be. and industry buyers in particular, is really good news for the industry. If we're very happy to consume quite a lot of fats, it makes their job much easier and they can earn their money much more easily.
So that's really the lowdown on fats as far as we're concerned. I think I should just add as well that we wouldn't want to give any recommendations to people based on their individual circumstances. So, for example, if you are suffering from blood sugar management issues, we're not suggesting go and eat as many carbohydrates as you want now and cut out the fats. Anything like that would need to be discussed with your medical practitioner. We're just really giving an overview, an umbrella view really about the whole area of fats as we see them. We think it's a fascinating area and we hope that you found it useful.